Welcome, welcome, welcome to the African Consciousness Truth Over Lies channel. Tonight I got a very, very important video to do. Too many of us have not been taught the reality of what it is to truly be Black in America. Too many of us have not been taught the true nature of the belly of the beast. Too many of us have not been taught the reality, glossed over by material things. Our young men and young women continue to be attacked, manipulated, not just against themselves and who they are, their identity, their consciousness, their subconsciousness, but against each other. The weaponization of our minds in ways in which the greats before us have not really, truly comprehend. So, I'm going to add to what's been missing. As the title of the video says, Cognitive Warfare and Black Males in America, this title was taken from an article, a 35-page article called Cognitive Warfare, Young Black Males in America, Perry Lee Moriarty and Williams Carson. Now, I want you guys to understand what is really going on. Okay, this is going to be probably do another 2 or 3 of these videos, and I'm going to label them in that matter. This will be part 1. It is really, really important that we share knowledge and information, that we start discussing these things, that we start not just seeing what's in front of us, but seeing what's behind us, on the side of us, on top of us, below us. And if we have to look, multiple layers on each of the direction that I just said, on top, above, below, left, right, and within us, within our minds. We have to start to analyze how we're behaving, how we're thinking, what we're not thinking about, how we're not behaving, and start to develop a critical analysis, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke used to say. We have to develop a critical analytic mind. The only way to save our people and each other is to start speaking the truth. Stop worrying about whether people are going to label you with a mental illness. They have done this to us anyway. From the time of the enslaved Africans running away, diagnosed with kleptomania, to the civil rights movement, where Black civil rights leaders, community leaders, were being diagnosed with what is called the psychosis prognosis, how schizophrenia became a Black disease, which is a book that you guys should definitely go and read. Okay? So let's get started. All right, I am going to bring up this article. Again, it is a 35-page article. Cognitive warfare in young black males in America. Before I do that, I want to read something. Okay? I want to read something. It's talking about cognitive warfare. All right? Influence not only what individuals think, but also the way they think, and ultimately the way they act. This is Major General Felipe Mastaciano. This is from the Cognitive Warfare Symposium. It is a 118-page document, okay, that outlines what cognitive warfare is, what they can do, how they do it, how it affects not just an individual, not just states leaders, but an entire population of people. Like I said, I don't say just these things just to say these things. My other channel, which is my targeted individual channels, I say the same thing. You don't have to believe me. I'm giving you and showing you the information. You do with it what you will. But we as black people need to start truly understanding what has taken place over the past, I would say, 60 years. And, you know, these people have been working in the background, creating the ultimate means to control us, to bypass our conscious mind. And as Dr. Amos Wilson says, to give us a false African consciousness. All right. So, introduction. During the 1990s, deep into America's war on crime and drugs, an incursion commenced against a target that had, at that point, remained largely outside the crosshairs. Prompted by rising crimes, prompted by rising crime rates and a handful of high-profile incidents, politicians, the media, and much of the public became consumed by what they characterized as a looming threat. What made this target distinct was that it belongs to a cohort traditionally shielded from public scorn by both law and custom. The target was a subset of America's own children. Waged in race-neutral terms, this war's racial connotations were unmistakable. The most violent, the most adult-like, and the most amoral of adolescents were young black males. This incursion bore many of the classic features of other modern American social wars: rhetorical excess, political extremism, graphic media, punitive policies, and perhaps most critically, the casting of the enemy as a moral reprobate. To this, the image of the adolescent super predator, a term a Princeton professor coined in 1995, was a particularly salient symbol. You know, it's always those white professors in these Ivy League schools that are constantly labeling, creating labels, labeling black men and black women, black boys, black girls. So we are always at the I don't want to say the word mercy, but we're almost at the footstool of these people, even today, right? And this was 1995. So imagine the terms they're using today. All right. This article considers the fallout of America's super predator war. Some of it was unambiguous. During the 1990s, nearly every state in the country enacted laws that made it easier to try kids as adults, expanded criminal court sentencing authority over juvenile offenders, and modified or eliminate juvenile court confidentiality laws. Now, The Guardian ran a few articles of the New York City Predator Department. This was this year about how they were unsealing the confidential sealed records of juvenile, most of them black, and have been leaking it to the media, the press, to other police organizations, as well as private businesses. So again, different times, but things remain the same. But we are more accepting of these things, even though the truth has come out about many things that we've been misled, manipulated to believe. These changes have been called the broadest and most sustained legislative crackdown ever on serious offenses committed by youth within the jurisdiction age of American juvenile courts. The result was the incarceration of literally thousands of youth, the majority of whom were black males. By 1998, African Americans constituted about 15% of youth under age 18, but nearly 2/3 of those transferred to adult court. A disparity for which crime commission rates could not begin to account. The country continues to feel the broader economic and socioeconomic reverberation of these numbers. Today, nearly one in 3 African American males in their 20s is under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. The focus of this article, however, is on a less visible set of phenomena. Why is it that we, as a country, were so willing during the 1990s to depart from our traditional posture of restraint towards child lawbreakers and adopt policies that have had such a devastating impact on so many of them? And why? Now that we know how disproportionately damaging these policies are, have we done virtually nothing to change them? Parts of the answer may lie in what this article calls the social psychology of social war. Recent research in the mechanics and effect of social cognition suggests that pre-existing stereotypes of the groups with which people are associated largely shape our perceptions of individuals. It further suggests that we rely on these stereotypes unconsciously and automatically, often without even realizing we are doing it. And that's part of cognitive warfare. Cognitive warfare takes place out in society, in the home, television, media, the internet. But you cannot see it because your conscious mind cannot see what is invisible. But your subconscious mind sees it. Your subconscious mind is being programmed by it. It further suggests that we rely on these stereotypes unconsciously and automatically, often without even realizing we're doing it. We also now know that both the content of our stereotypes and the frequency with which they are activated and applied are especially susceptible to certain outside influence. Importantly, several studies from the last 2 decades suggest that the graphic media imagery, political posturing, militaristic rhetoric, and Manichean moralizing, often associated with American social wars, are among these influences. These images and ideas impact not just the type of association we make with our enemies, conflating Muslims with terrorism, Latinos with drug smuggling, and African Americans with crime, for instance, but also the likelihood that we will draw upon these associations when we evaluate them. The more negative the association, the more negative the evaluation. And the more likely it is that we will support punitive response to the threat we perceive. In the case of the super predator war, however, it is not only the mental associations, but also the mental disassociations that were critical. At the same time, the super predator war amplified the American public predisposition to associate adolescents of color, and in particular young black males, with violent and moral depravity. It also led the public to disassociate young black males with the one trait that should have been up for debate: their youth. The result was a veritable the result was a veritable feedback loop whose cognitive output, the mental imprint of morally impoverished super predators, continually fed its input. Thus, even as crime rates among black youth have dropped steadily since the mid 1990s, these self-reinforced associations and disassociations have prompted lawmakers and their constituents to continue to support laws and policies that they know disproportionately punish and incapacitate young black males. Admittedly, factors over that than social war and social psychology have played a pivotal role in this dynamic. For instance, the history of race relations in this country, changes in our attitudes towards punishment, raising violent crime rates among adolescents, and conscious political strategy also play a role. But a look at the juvenile justice policies and youth imprisonment rate of other Western countries, even those that experience a similar spike in adolescent crime during the period in question, suggests that we are extreme in our degree of political and social antipathy towards young offenders, and nearly alone in our willingness to champion policies to punish them as harshly as adults. Not coincidentally, we have also been virtually alone in our willingness to wage what this article characterized as a veritable domestic social war against them. Now, when I read stuff like this, the labels that we allow white politicians, white scholars, white lawyers, white people in general to put on us, on our children. And I keep saying to myself, why do we do that? Why do we allow a group of people who we know from their history and from what they continue to do against us, and what they did against us as we were children, to what they are still doing our children. And we are silent about these things. And then I became targeted. Well, my brother became targeted. I didn't understand what he was going through. But then I became targeted by white police officers in the New York Predator Department. And I dedicated to exposing them, bringing the attention to the public, particularly for black people, in what they were doing. So there was a lot of research I had to do, a lot of research I couldn't do, because this takes a toll, right? I mean, the false labeling, the false narrative, the things that they'll do, the covert drugging, the use of women and men to come into your space, your life, so they can manipulate you for all kinds of reasons. But the main reason, is that you love yourself as a black person and you love black people. And you want what's best for not only yourself, but for black people. The one thing the white supremacists truly hate is black unity. The other thing they really hate is love of self as a black man, as a black woman, and the love of each other as black people. All right, so this article proceeds in two primary parts. Part 2 traces the origin, manifestation, and impact on the so-called American super predator war that emerged in the late 1980s and lasted until the early 2000s, when the war on terror took center stage, beginning with a brief discussion of the history and anatomy of modern American social wars. It explores the laws, policies, politics, and rhetoric that coincide with dynamic increases in the incarceration of black youth during the super predator era. Part 3 considers the role that social psychology may have played in this progression and in the progression of social wars more generally. Drawing upon recent studies into causes, function, and consequences of social cognition, this article urged that stereotypes linking race, adolescence, and crime drove at the same time reinforced and manifestation of war, Part 2 described. The result was a self-reinforcing feedback loop that has altered the social meaning of young black male in profound and intraceable ways. Because the majority of the people in this country now harbor such stereotypes about the criminality, deviance, and adultness of young black males, large segments of the public remain willing to enact, administer, and support policies that cause substantial and disproportionate harm to this segment of our youth population and are amongst the harshest in the Western world. The anatomy of the American social wars. Now, before I read this, I want to read something for you guys. Again, I like to put things into its proper context so that we understand. So we as black people no longer blame each other for the way we behave, for how we think. There are very few black people in America that have their own thinking ability. We are manipulated beyond any other group of people on this planet. That we think that our consciousness truly belongs to us. But if you don't know these things, if you don't know your history, if you don't know how those that oppress us think, if we don't know what it is that they're up to on every facet that affect us in this society and globally, because I'll tell you what, they have continuously engaged in experiments, development of technology, development of viruses, diseases, specifically to control and destroy us. Okay, there is something that I wanted to read. Where is it? Here it is. All right, I want you to listen to this. Okay. Cognitive warfare is the most advanced form of human mental manipulation to date, permitting influence over individual or collective behavior with the goal of obtaining a tactical and strategic advantage. In this domain of action, the human brain becomes the battlefield. The pursued objective is to influence not only what the target thinks, but also the way they think and ultimately the way they act. Cognitive warfare is necessarily associated with other modes and domains of action for reaching targeted brains, such as cyber warfare and information warfare. As a concept, cognitive warfare also includes another critical domain that is fast evolving: the cognitive neurosciences. By facilitating the understanding of the brain cognitive mechanisms, i.e., the way the brain processes the different categories of information, the neuroscience will allow optimization for the use of other forms of warfare, notably information warfare. So, we know that the US military invented the internet in 1978. We know for a little over a decade, they've been using it. They've been developing it to the point where they've now given it to the American telecom industry. The American telecom industry and its overseas subsidiary began to implement what we now know today as the internet. The information superhighway, where the flow of information, ones and zeros, are the vehicles traveling back and forth. Okay, now do you think that they gave these American telecom company, this product without building into this product the ability to wage war, the ability to influence information? Okay, I will be doing a video specifically dedicated to cognitive warfare, the history of it, what it's entail, including neurocognitive warfare, which I think a lot of particularly black people don't want to believe. They never wanted to believe, right? We see private companies such as Elon Musk, Tesla, Apple, others engaging in the development of BCI, brain computer interface. Okay. We see uh, hospitals now implanting microchip into patients. But what else do we see? We see black people as being the only group of people, right, who really don't understand the technological progresses that are being made. That a lot of us still believe that, you know, a person's brain cannot be microchipped and they cannot be controlled. But this goes back, way back, in the use of the development of radio wave and microwave frequency, weaponization of those frequency to do what? To embed messages, subliminal messages into the human mind. I always say whenever negative things happen to black people in America, whether it be individuals or group, that is not an accident, coincidence, a natural occurring thing, or an act of God. It is the white supremacists, those in the position of authority, those that own biochemical companies, those that own pharmaceutical companies, those that own medical hospital, medical facilities, medical testing facilities, the military, security agencies. We are at the mercy of these people, and they have shown us no mercy. What they've done is to manipulate our minds so that we don't see the truth. Just as how they manipulate our minds when they coin the term super predator and attach it to young black boys. This is how the New York Predator Department tortured 5 innocent black boys at the time. They called them the most disgusting, profane names, and the black community fell for it. The black community fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. The black community did not once say to the NYPD, why did you torture these kids? Why did you starve them? Why did you use coercive threats? Why did you brainwash these kids to confess to a crime that they didn't commit? And you have black people so deceived, saying, well, they must have did the crime because they confessed to it. And what do we know today? We know that police can use psychological manipulation. They can use torture to convince an innocent person to confess to a crime they didn't commit. Okay? So, where was I? Over the last half century, this country has been in a perpetual state of war. From Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty to the wars on crime and drugs to our current war on terror, a smaller incursion against cancer and immigration, we as a nation have spent the last 50 years in an ever-present posture of social anxiety and metaphorical combat. Each of this century's most prominent social wars has followed a similar pattern. An intense period of political posturing about the dangers of the chosen target, accompanied by episodic, episodic media coverage of a few sensational incidents, followed by a period of public outcry and polls that reflect the public's mounting fear of the target, followed finally by a fury of punitive laws at both the federal and state level that lawmakers have justified as efforts to reassure the anxious public. More often than not, these laws have disproportionately negatively impact on a racial and ethnic outgroup. America's wars on crime and drugs are illustrative. The super predator war followed a similar pattern. One difference, however, is that unlike the racial minorities and poor whites, the war on crime and drugs swept up our adolescent population had never before experienced a groundwell of social antipathy that the super predator war generated. And I always say, isn't it funny how within the past 30 years or 3 decades, we see white men and white boys using the most lethal of weapons, commit some of the most heinous crimes, mass murders that we as a nation has ever seen. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Mass murders that we, within the past, I would say, 30 years, we have seen so many of it, so much of it. But they're not called super predators. The U.S. government, the health department, CDC, they're not taking DNA samples of young white boys and men to look for a genetic marker that makes them predisposed to become mass murderers and serial killers. Right? But that was the excuse for literally stealing the DNAs of thousands, tens of thousands of black boys. Why is that? This part retraced the origin and ramification of the war on crime and the war on drugs. It begins by recounting the ways in which politics and media drove public support for the war's most punitive policies. Next, it discussed the impact of these wars on racial minorities in the justice system. Politics, media, public opinion, and lawmaking. The war on crime. The law and order rhetoric that has dominated political discourse in the United States for the last half century first emerged in the late 1950s. Southern politicians, angered by the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, called for a crackdown on the hoodlums and agitators who challenged segregation and African Americans' disenfranchisement. Crime officially took its place on the national political scene a decade later with presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, thinly veiled crime in the streets condemnation. History shows us that nothing prepares the way for tyranny more than the failure of public officials to keep the streets from bullies and marauders. Goldwater warned during his acceptance speech at the 1964 Republican Convention. That message resonated with the public. By 1968, more than 4 in 5 U.S. citizens agreed that law and order had broken down, that crime was on the rise, and that Negroes who started riots were the cause. Being tough on crime has been a virtual political necessity ever since. The news media was an indispensable ally. This has been especially true since the onset of the soft news era of the late 1990s. Between 1990 and 1993, crime leaped from the fifth to the first most coveted topic on the national evening news. By the end of the decade, coverage of homicides had increased more than fivefold. If it bleeds, it leads, became the mantra. According to public poll, the American people believe the hype. From 1994 to 1998, respondents to national poll consistently identified crime as the most important problem the nation faced. In the 1997 Los Angeles Times poll, 80% of respondents stated that the media's portrayal of violent crime has increased their personal fear of becoming a crime victim. Now, here's the thing. When you go back and you look at the data, go look at the crime stat data, okay? We know that because there are more white people in America, that white people commit more crimes than anybody else, okay? We know that most crimes that are done to white people are committed by white people. We know that more crimes that are committed against black people are done by other black people. We know that most crimes that are done by Hispanics are committed by other Hispanic people. But if you see every single day, okay, and here's the thing, right? The majority of the news with the homicide involving black people, you'll see is done by other black people. Okay, if there is a crime committed by a black person against a white person, it gets sensationalized. But if the images that you see every single day, for the most part, is black people committing crimes against other black people, how is it that white people are so afraid? How is it that white people are so afraid? At least that's what they say. So you have to understand how white people are on code. And the deceptions and the lie that they will engage in, because they all have a political agenda, which is to see the destruction of black people, particularly black men. Deeming them necessary to reassure an anxious public, lawmakers follow each law and order panic wave with a series of executive actions and legislative changes. In 1968, for example, in an attempt to neutralize the attack of Republican candidates contending that he was soft on crime, President Johnson signed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which increased funding for law enforcement, attempt to overturn Supreme Court precedent protecting criminal defendants, and provided for expanded use of wiretaps and Miranda-less confessions. The Omnibus Bill was the first of many federal tough on crime laws that legislators would enact over the next 3 decades. These included the Omnibus Bill's eventual successor, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which authorized more than $30 billion for crime prevention efforts, law enforcement, and state prison constructions. Okay? The popping up of what? Private prisons in the 1990s. More draconian were the laws individual states enacted during the war on crime. One quintessential example is California's 3-strike laws. which mandates 25 years to life sentences following conviction for any third felony. New Jersey's Megan Law, which requires sex offender registration and public notification, is another. Now, let me speak on this for a moment. Okay? You see what happens when a little white girl, okay, uh, when a crime is being committed against little white girls. Meanwhile, black girls, up until to this day, are being kidnapped and thrown into sex trafficking rings. Right? We see today that the majority of these crimes against black girls and black women go unsolved. There isn't a priority against that because the media is going to pick and choose. Let's say the powers that be, they are going to pick and choose what to sensationalize because they understand how we are being manipulated, how we have been conditioned. Right? When young black children disappear, there's no media coverage, barely any. Right? The serial killer in, what was it? Detroit. I want to say it's Detroit. White man who was killing black women. No FBI involvement, no police investigation until the citizens had to do the job of the police. And yet we still think that these people care. As Dr. Amos Wilson said, we have to be a damn fool. We see what's going on, but we pretend that it's not happening. Today, more than half of all states have habitual felony offenders laws akin to California's 3 strikes law. And all 50 states have a version of Megan's law. In addition, nearly every state has adopted truth in sentences laws, mandatory minimum sentences law, and zero tolerance practices. These laws and policies have resulted in harsher penalties and the virtual elimination of rehabilitation programs. Okay? Now, I was going to mention this. I forgot to mention this. It's one of the reasons why I had sidetracked. But America, okay, 43 out of the 50 states in America allow for adults to marry children. 20 states in America have no age limit in which an adult can marry a child. Okay? But we don't ever want to talk about that. Right? We don't ever want to talk about the realities, the way things are. We want to follow along with narratives created by those that want to destroy us, that want to see us fail. And we want to pretend that we are part of this so-called melting pot when the reality shows us that we are not. We as black people believe more in America than America believes in black people. Black people will fight and die for this country. And come back home and be treated like shit. And I'm going to say it. Yeah, treated like shit. Like the dirt underneath their shoes. right? The deliberate poisoning of black people, black children with lead, with air pollutant, with chemicals in the soil in which they build homes and sell to black people, in which they build public housing that houses black people. But every day we skip along. Because this is Kumbaya land. This is the utopia. And I just want to put things in a more realistic aspect. Okay? The war on drugs. Launched on the heel of the war on crime, the war on drugs was even more ambiguous. Not heavily regulated during the first half of the century, drugs emerged as a potent political issue in the second half. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one and created a new agency, the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, which received enhanced funding for drug treatment and enforcement. This would be the first and the last time during the war on drugs that more funding went towards treatment than punishment. In 1985, nearly 4/5 of funds lawmakers allocated to the drug program went to law enforcement. All right. Now we know when Nixon created this war on crime, particularly the war on drugs, was specifically geared to target black people and what he called the so-called hippies. Okay. So again, we wait 3-4 decades before the truth comes out. Meanwhile, you have people living in those times who were saying the exact same thing. And what did the people do to them? What did they say to them? They're crazy. They're conspiracy theorists and so forth. Go and read Gary Webb's book, The Messenger. Dark Alliance, I should say. Okay? Following in Nixon's footsteps, subsequent administrations successfully used the war on drugs to cast drug use as a moral problem. By framing drug addicts as aggressors rather than victims, the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administration zero tolerance policies towards drug use made sense. The best known example and a centerpiece of Ronald Reagan's presidency was Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, a phrase she coined while speaking at an Oakland grade school. Almost overnight, thousands of Just Say No groups emerged, which largely targeted white middle-class children under the rubric of Just Say No. It was entirely a matter of individual choice to use or become involved in drug use. Again, the news media was only too happy to cooperate, and the infiltration of crack cocaine into urban areas in the mid-1980s gave them their storyline. By 1986, major news magazines were running cover stories calling crack the plague among us. The media focused, in particular, on crack cocaine use by African Americans and the alleged crack baby epidemic, postulating a biological underclass of children who would require state support for the rest of their lives. The media also linked crack babies to other inner city crimes such as prostitution and gang violence. crack babies became a convenient symbol for an aggressive war on drug users because of the implication that anyone who is selfish enough to irreparably damage a child for the sake of a quick high deserve retribution. Federal and state law took swift action in an apparent attempt to placate a concerned public. The 1970s saw the centralization of federal drug agencies, including the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency and increased federal prosecution of drug use and trafficking. Federal legislation soon followed suit with the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 and later the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which established the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing disparities for crack versus powder cocaine. State laws were equally harsh. Perhaps the most notorious was the 1973 Rockefeller drug laws in New York, which increased penalties from 2 to 5 years for first-time drug offenders under the Boggs Act and to mandatory 15 years to life sentences for subsequent offenses. Racial and penal segregation. More than one author has suggested that politicians must have known that the war on crime and drugs would have desperate impact on African American communities. And some have argued that lawmakers enact those policies precisely because they would have such a desperate impact. Again, deliberate. Right? But we as black people, particularly here in America, when it comes to the election, fighting over, the two-party system, Democrat, Republican. Why are we fighting over these political parties? What have they done within the past 4 or 5 decades to improve the life of black people? Now you see today what they're doing. The Democrats bringing in migrants, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, now I'm not saying that, you don't let refugees in, and particularly since America is directly responsible for a lot of the problems that is going on in most countries in South America. But then say to black people, black ADOS America, that we're not going to give you reparation. We don't have the money. To say to black people with children, we don't have the money to expand the summer job programs, right? So your kids can work, right? Have some responsibility. Just like when I, in the 1980s, and I worked in the summer job programs, it was instrumental in me having my brother, taking some of the financial burden off of our mother, right? We buy school clothes, book bags, sneakers, what have you for school. Okay? Instrumental. And we see programs like that has been shrunken. But yet, they can find the hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay? When they're denying poor people food stamps. But they can find it in the budget for migrants. Well, if they can find it in the budget for migrants, they can find it in the budget for poor black people and for poor white people, for poor Hispanic people, for poor Asian people who is here, either American citizens or permanent residents. But it's funny, as Tupac said, right? They can find money for war, but they can't find money to feed the poor. The defense budget It's almost $1 trillion. The U.S. government hires private military contractors at the tunes of tens of billions of dollars. New defense contract companies are being created with the promise of government contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. But we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about that. We don't even want to talk about this. Why? Because of this. Let's go to the. Because of this. Cognitive warfare. When you read this and other papers about cognitive warfare, and you're a black person, you'll begin to understand. Truly understand. The impact of these measures is largely undebatable. Between 1970 and 2003, the U.S. prison population increased from 200,000 to 1.4 million at 780 per 100,000. U.S. incarceration rates are now 4 to 5 times higher than Spain, England, and New Zealand, and 7 to 10 times higher than those in most Western countries. Individual states have seen similar spikes in imprisonment. Since their enactment in 1973, the Rockefeller drug laws, for example, have increased New York prison population by 500%. These changes have primarily impact persons of color. While it had long been the case that racial and ethnic minorities were more likely to be arrested, charged, and incarcerated than their white counterparts, these disparities increased considerably during the late 1980s and 1990s. African Americans constituted about 1/3 of all state and federal prisoners in the United States in 1960s, but by 1995, they made up approximately 1/2 of the prison population between 1980 and 2006. The increase in African American rates of imprisonment was nearly 4 times the increase of white rates. Individual states saw similar changes. For example, while African Americans and Latino make up just about 1/3 of New York population, they constitute 94% of those convicted under the Rockefeller drug laws. Until its appeal, the federal 100-to-1 sentencing scheme for crack cocaine had a similar effect. In 1992, for example, 92.6% of those sentenced in the United States under the 100-to-1 regime were African Americans. These numbers are especially troubling because multiple studies have shown that whites use drugs at higher rates than African American and sell drugs at roughly equivalent rates. How is that for truth for you? Okay. By 1999, studies showed that an African American man born in the 1960s had a 1 in 5 chance of spending at least 1 year in prison. For those who had not completed high school, the number climbed to 1 in 3. In 2002, a full 12% of African American men in their 20s were incarcerated. That's 12% of African American men in 2002. So if they're in their 20s, right, this is what, 2024? Okay, so they're what? In their 40s now? 50, early 50s? All right, and listen to this. This means that today, 33% of African American men in their 20s are in jail, on probation, or on parole. And 33% of African American baby boys born in 2001 will spend time behind bars. Amazingly, much of this has happened during a period of falling crime rates, with African American crime commission rates falling at a faster rate than any other group. Now, why is that? Because black men woke up. Black men who served time in prison woke up and realized what was happening to them. Okay? But here's the thing, they did not en masse educate younger black boys as to the tactics and methods used, because they themselves, and I don't blame them, because they themselves, once they went into that prison system, they were being manipulated. Okay, I'm going to bring up an article, not an article, but this is a paper written by black, formerly incarcerated black men. Okay, really couldn't find that PDF, but it's a PDF document by a group of formerly incarcerated black men who have earned college degrees and did a research paper, and very interesting stuff. If I do find it, I'm going to do a separate video, because I think it's important that we understand that they were black men who realized what was happening in the prison system, right? That the U.S. government was engaging in psychological warfare, cognitive warfare. And so when these black men came out of the prison system, they were no longer who they were before. This is why you start to see them wearing their pants below their bottoms, right? This stuff comes out of the prison system. And in the prison system, black men are being psychologically manipulated, and black boys also. Okay. So, the super predator war. The first section of this part described the emergence of the iconographic image of the adolescent super predator as a symbol of juvenile crime in the United States. It then discusses the concomitant adaptation of punitive juvenile justice policies throughout the country. Next, it details the way these policies changes when impact these policy changes have impact youth of color. The coming of the adolescent super predator. It is remarkable that a proponent of the war on crime and drugs would turn their sights to adolescents in the early 1990s, especially when one considers the history and purpose of the U.S. juvenile justice system established at the turn of the 20th century. This country's juvenile justice system rests on the prevailing progressive philosophy that the system should treat rather than punish child offenders. In the case of children, the belief was that delinquent acts were not born of malviolence, but rather were the product of social forces largely beyond the children's control. The Supreme Court emphasized that the child was to be treated and rehabilitated, and the procedures from apprehension through institutionalization were to be clinical rather than punitive. The U.S. juvenile justice system has experienced shift in penal philosophy over time. During the first half of the 20th century, a Belief in rehabilitation and in individualized treatment gave way to concern over the indeterminate nature of dispositions. Juvenile offenders often receive the worst of both worlds. Neither the protection according to adults nor the solicitous care and regenerative treatment postulated for children. The Supreme Court lamented in 1966. In response, the court imported a series of key constitutional safeguards from the adult system during the 1960s and 1970s, including the rights to notice, to counsel, to confront and cross-examine witnesses, to a fair and impartial hearing, and to protections against self-incrimination. With these changes, however, came increased formality and the ideological shift in focus from the best interests of the offenders to the gravity of the offense itself. Nonetheless, few anticipated the changes in the 1990s, while the push for more punitive juvenile justice policies had already begun in the late 1980s as members of both parties witnessed the political benefits of getting tough on crime. Okay, just what they always do. They're going to throw black people, black boys, black girls under the bus to achieve their political aspirations. The black Sambos in politics do it. The racist whites and Hispanics do it. Even the racist Asians do it also. Okay, here we go. The most notable of these was the infamous Central Park jogger case. In April 1989, a young white female jogger was brutally beaten, raped, and left, I should say raped and left to die in Manhattan Central Park. Within hours, police arrested and charged a group of 7 African Americans and Latino teens ranging in age from 14 to 16 with rape, assault, and attempted murder. Almost immediately, a new term was coined. The incident was part of a new adolescent practice known as wilding. Again, this is what they do. The labelings. Local politicians seized on the incident in the summer of 1989. New York City Mayor Edward Koch called for the death penalty for wilding, deemed the 7 suspects monsters, and complained that the juvenile justice system was too lenient. A similar response came from mayoral candidate David Dinkins, who responded with a call for a new anti-wilding law. Now, I want you to understand something. When you have racist police, okay, making up terms, right, creating whatever narrative they want to create, because, in these racist minds, black boys are, they're magical, the magical Negroes, right? The ones who can turn into beasts, the one who stare at you and eyes turn red like fire and look like a gorilla. That's what they say, right? So we continue to allow these racist predator police under police forces across America to just dictate whatever narrative they want. And the public eats it up. And particularly for us as black people. And I understand, okay, as black people, we are so traumatized from living under the system of white supremacy. And what it does to our mind. And how our mind, in order to protect itself, right? And also because how it's being conditioned, we ignore a lot of things. Because they want you to keep thinking positive, think happy thoughts. Well, in China, okay, how they condition their population is through credit rating. If you're walking down the street, you're not smiling, there are cameras everywhere. You go to the bank, you go to a restaurant, you walk down the street. That using facial recognition, if you are not smiling, your credit rating is downgraded. But in the US, particularly amongst black people, conditioned in the conditioned mind and state that we are in, okay, that's why you see a lot of black people, they'll say, no negativity around here. And usually the negativity they're talking about is the truth. Okay? You can't tell them the truth, particularly Nigerian women. You cannot tell them the truth. They don't want to hear it. So the reason why I gave China as an example is to show you that how people can be conditioned using external factors. Okay? But in China, at least you know. But here in the US, when they engage in psyops, cognitive warfare, you don't know. You don't know. And the only people that can see the detrimental result of these programs, right? These psyops, these cognitive warfare programs, are the people that don't look like you and me. Right? And they know what's going on. But like I said, they are on code. We don't have a code as black people. You know, Nellie Fuller he has a book called The Propensatory Code Book, and how black people should behave, how we should think, how we should treat each other. White people will know that there are people that look like them within the US government, within the security agencies, within corporations, whose job is to do things to black people in America so that black people do not get to a state and point in which they have any sort of power, any sort of political power, economical power, in terms of controlling the resources in our community, right? The businesses in our community. And what we see, we know that every time black people gain significant wealth, what white America would do, there will always be an economic downturn that will wipe out the majority of the gains in which black people made in this country. They went from burning down towns with lies, right, to using white predators in certain industries, housing, automobile, finance, to manipulate black people. And then, I should say business also, and then pull the rug out from under our feet. See, we don't look at it in that way because we have become too closed in our own bubble, right? Groups of people we hang out with, you know, we love to engage in delusional talks, right? But leveling up, everything's leveling up. You know, you're not on my frequency. Yo, what frequency are you on? Because you may be doing well, you're in a higher frequency. You're not on a higher frequency. You're just asleep. The minute you come into any kind of consciousness and the minute you start to take actions in terms of trying to do things to build up black people, to build up black communities, you're going to be attacked. It hasn't changed. White people have not changed one bit. We have changed. They have changed us into a passive, docile, zombified group of people. Where is those amongst us that are critical thinkers? Right? I gave an example of Beyonce not being nominated for the Country Music Awards. Okay, who cares? Right? In the 1990s, a black man named what's his name? Bob Johnson created a cable network called BET. Why can't these rich black people get together and say, you know what? We're going to create our own movie awards, our own music awards, whether it be, there is the BET Music Awards, but I'm talking create a country music award. Call it the Black Country Music Award. We are trying, because again, we are traumatized. So we try to get into genres that we create, that white people say, you know what? We own this now. Okay? Take it back from them. Stop watching the Country Music Award if you're a black person. Don't watch it. Okay? And there's any good white people out there? Don't watch it either. We have to start creating our own things. But it is a hard race. It is a race that has been difficult for us because of, again, cognitive warfare. Okay? So, as crime rates continued to climb in the early 1990s, the calls for stiffer penalties for juvenile offenders reached a fever pitch. Unlike the wars on crime and drugs, however, there was no executive clarion call to arms. The closest thing to a declaration came in the form of a 1995 magazine article, The Coming of the Super Predators. Former Princeton University political science professor John DeLulio warned of an oncoming tsunami of adolescent super predators, morally impoverished youth who had grown up surrounded by deviant, delinquent, and criminal adults in abusive, violent-ridden, fatherless, godless, and jobless settings. You see, when you understand the minds of white people, you understand that when they say these things, it's because they are conditioning a whole section of people into that sort of thinking. Right? This is why I say black people need to read up on cognitive warfare. Okay, this is from NATO. Right? Now, what I'm reading was written in 2012. Right? Cognitive warfare on young black males in America. Right? So the term has always been there. This is the new term. Right? There were very few of us who understand or know the term and understand what the term means. I wasn't one of them. Okay? But I know the term now. And I know what it is. Okay? So here's another example of cognitive warfare as a definition. Cognitive warfare is a convergence of cyber psychology, weaponization of neurosciences, and cyber influence for the provoked alteration of the perception of the world and its rational analysis in the military, politician, and other actors and decision makers for the purpose of altering their decision or action of a strategic superiority at all levels of tactical intervention concerning individuals or collective natural intelligence as well as artificial or augmented intelligence in hybrid system. Now, this is more on the military political level, the control of nation states leaders, right? The manipulation of information through political systems as well as military system, government systems, altering decisions and actions to gain a strategic superiority on all levels. Okay? All levels. So understand this. When they are saying these, putting out these terms out there, it is because they have engaged in cognitive warfare against black people and they already know the outcome. So they're telling you what the outcome is going to be. These were the kids who have absolutely no respect for human life and no sense of the future, stone cold predators. 1 year later, DeLulio projected that by the year 2010, there would be approximately 270,000 more juvenile super predators on the streets than there were in 1990. In my Black Crime Problems and Ours, Professor DeLulio predicted that the black crime rate, both black on black and black on white, is increasing so that as many as half of these juvenile super predators would be young black males. Now, why is they never mention white on white crimes? Why is it they never mention these young white boys and white men committing mass murders? Why is it that they never mention that the majority of young people who smoke marijuana, who do cocaine, are white boys and white men? Again, the control of information, it's all part of cognitive warfare. They already knew these terms. They just didn't tell us about it because they did not want us looking into it. The news media ran with this narrative in a headline announcing that the super predators have arrived. Newsweek asks, should we cage the new breed of vicious kids? Now remember, in the 1970s, and actually, matter of fact, in exactly 1970, the New York Times article featuring Dr. Jose Delgado, who was a CIA neurologist and scientist, says the article headline was, "What kind of human being would we like to create?" And in that article, his experimentation with using radio wave frequency, microchipping of rhesus monkeys to control their behaviors. And he stated in that very same article that in the future, that human beings will be controlled not only through microchips, but also through the radio wave and microwave frequency spectrum. wirelessly controlling people like how you would control a remote control car. The news media ran with this, and shout out to Dr. Phil Valentines and Bobby Hemmett. What the two black men that I watch, so many times, that talks about these things. So, borrowing rhetoric from the wars on crime and drugs, the theme of moral depravity again played a central role. Kids Without a Conscience, Axe, the cover of People magazine in June 1997. The style of news reporting that dominated the era only reinforced the message. It is coverage of juvenile offending. News media often rely on a technique called episodic framing. Instead of placing an individual incident in its broader statistical, political, and socioeconomic context, the news media frequently reported juvenile offenders as discrete events, which social scientists claim encourages viewers to associate the conduct in question with the moral deficiency of the individual rather than her broader social milieu. When the topic is crime, episodic framing galvanized support for more punitive crime policies. So using the media to frame certain narrative, to instill fear within the general public, so they will support for more punitive punishment when it comes to crime. By all indications, the American public was listening, even as national crime rates were dropping steadily. So again, we see this is what they do. Doesn't matter if the crime rate is low, how they're shaping narrative, how they're framing things, the messaging, the types of words that they're using, what type of image that they're showing, how they're showing it, what time, the music that they play, words that are used to do what? To bypass our conscious mind, to create that deep fear in our subconscious that we don't even know where that fear comes from. All right, it is what is also is called neuro-linguistic programming, or dark NLP. By all indications, the American public was listening, even as national crime rates were dropping steadily. A theory of public opinion polls conducted in the late 1990s revealed the American public's fear of violent juvenile offenders. Okay, now there's a YouTube channel is called the Academy of Ideas. Okay, there are videos on how society is manipulated. Another video is how the elites create a paranoid society. All right, these are videos that will be very, very helpful in understanding, how whole society can be manipulated using fear-based tactics. Could be given a mental illness or mental illnesses. Okay, so the website, the YouTube channel is called the Academy of Ideas. Go look it up. Polls also reveal that the public substantially overestimated the likelihood of being victimized by a person of color. Nearly twice as many respondents to a 1994 poll, for example, believe that they were more likely to be victimized by a perpetrator of color than a white perpetrator, when in reality, listen to this, the vast majority of crimes are intra-racial, meaning that within each racial group, those that are committing crimes against each the each other looks like them. They're within the same racial grouping. Okay. Public opinion polls also revealed a concern that America's youth had lost their moral compasses. In 2001, a report that the Framework Institute published, which compiled information from dozens of surveys on perceptions of youth, was particularly illuminated. Among the findings the study reported were the following. In response to a 1998 survey, only 16% of Americans said that young people under the age of 30 shared most of their moral and ethical value. In a separate 1998 poll, when asked what comes to mind when they think of teens, nearly 3/4 of the respondents gave negative descriptions such as rude, wild, or irresponsible. 82% of adults who responded to a 1998 poll felt that youth did not have a strong sense of right and wrong, up from 46% in 1965 and 34% in 1952. Not surprisingly, respondents overwhelmingly endorsed punitive response to juvenile offending. Ostensibly to ameliorate these concerns, lawmakers responded. Between 1992 and 1997 alone, legislators in 45 states enacted the enhanced waiver laws that made it easier to transfer juvenile offenders to the criminal justice system. 31 states gave both juvenile and criminal courts expanded sentencing authorities over juvenile offenders. 47 states enacted laws that modified or removed traditional juvenile court confidentiality provisions by making records and proceedings more open. And 22 states expanded the role of juvenile crime victims in the juvenile justice process. Now, this is where you need to put on your critical thinking cap and understand that during those times, okay, you see a lot of private prisons being built, a lot of private juvenile facilities being built. There's an infamous case in New Jersey in where you had a judge that was being paid by a private juvenile facility, their owners, to do what? To send kids to that facilities. Okay? Kids who were not convicted of violent crimes, that should have been given probation or have their cases, some of them dismissed. But he was raking in millions of dollars. So when we look, particularly within the black community, we look at each other, particularly if you have a criminal record, we don't have no inclination of the reality in which a lot of us grew up in, the reality of the war that has taken place, that has been waged on black men and black boys in particular, but black women too. As we see from the early 2000s up until today, young black women and black girls, right, are the second highest group that are being incarcerated. All right. When we see the psychological conditioning of black women in terms of believing that they can do whatever because there is no accountability, they're not being held accountable, and they accept no responsibility because it is the state, it is the white supremacists that are allowing this. But sooner or later, okay, sooner or later, they're going to come calling. And then what? What they're doing again, cognitive warfare, created a certain mindset in the minds of our women and young girls. And as I say, cognitive warfare, you do not see what's being done. You only see the negative impact. And by that time, it is too late. California Proposition 21 is among the harshest of these laws. Proposition 21 requires adult trials for juvenile as young as 14 years of age if they have been charged with a list of enumerated felonies. It also transfers absolute discretion from judges to prosecutors to determine which juveniles should be tried as adults. Weaken confidentiality laws, toughen gang laws, and expands California's three-strike law for both juveniles and adults. Ironically, voters ratified the referendum in 2000, a time when arrest rate amongst juveniles were hitting their lowest point in 30 years. So again, how could that be? Right? They have conditioned the public, even though they knew crime rates was going down for juvenile. That is the power of cognitive warfare. What was coined at the time, psychological warfare. Okay? The net effect of these laws was astounding. Between 1985 and 1994, the number of delinquent cases waived to criminal courts climbed 83%, from 7,200 to 13,200. In 1998, approximately 1,600 juvenile offenders was confined to adult jails. By 1997, there were more than 9,000. By some estimate, nearly 2,000 juvenile offenders in adult jail were serving sentences of life without possibility of parole. To put this in perspective, no other country in the Western world sent juveniles to prison for life, and by 2005, every country except the United States and Somalia had ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which explicitly forbid life imprisonment without possibility of release for offenses committed by persons below 18 years of age. In the late 1990s, Congress jumped into the fray. In 1997, the Senate Judiciary Committee took up the Violence and Repealed Juvenile Offenders Act of 1997, which proposed multiple tough measures for juvenile offenders, including a provision that lowers the minimum age for trial of capital offenses from 18 to 16. Senator Orrin Hatch, one of the act's sponsored, explained that people are expecting us to do something about these violent teenagers. We got to move on this. Although it was never put to a vote in 1997, the act resurfaced in 1999 after the shooting of Columbine High School. The proposed consequences for Juvenile Offenders Act of 1998 again include multiple measures to make it easier for prosecutors to try children as adults. Although it subsequently died in conference, the act failed only because of an attached provision that strengthened firearms control laws. Ironically, while Congress was prepared to exact harsh punishment on juveniles in the name of public safety, it was not willing to adopt laws that would keep firearms out of their hands. Okay? So, I will be doing another part on this, a part 2 on this. Stay tuned. I hope this was informative. And I hope we begin to become, come into some level of consciousness to understand that these things are still going on. But now we are more distracted and defeated because of cognitive warfare being waged on us. And if you cannot see it, there's nothing you can do. Unless you have those in your circle who understands these things, who can show you, who can teach you. And what they have done is made our elders afraid of our young black children. So we're basically throwing our kids into the fire without anything to save them, or throwing them into the ocean without a life jacket. What do you think is going to happen? All right. Talk to you guys in the next video.